So you're probably wondering how my father came under the care of the Waifs and Strays Society. Well, contrary to the myth of the orphan running around on the streets, my father was 3.5 when he was apprehended. Illegally, again, because children under 4 could not be taken away by anyone. Forcibly, because the police turned up and dragged him away from his family, which he never saw again. How could that happen? Many different reasons. Some of them are almost laughable. My grandparents were married, but not to each other. So they had an affair. And my father was created. The problem was my grandparents were married to other people. My grandmother married a much older man. He was 20 years her senior. That was bound to work out. My grandfather, all of 22, married, made a mistake, separated, moved back home to his father and stepmother. Oh my God, what happened next? They fell in love and my dad was created, so all hell broke loose. My grandparents moved off when my father was born. My grandfather decided when my father was less than a year old to join the Army. He was in the Army from 1910 to 1919. He served in Africa, in Kenya, he served in France, he was wounded twice, became an instructor. Somehow he was in England long enough to have 4 other children with my grandmother. But they weren't married, they were living together in sin. That was enough for the agencies to take children away from their families. They could simply disapprove of how people were living or providing for their children. Dr. Bernardo, who was not actually a doctor, took it upon himself to conduct benevolent abductions, save the children from their evil families. So he could walk into a house, gather up the children, take them away, and there was no one to oppose him. In fact, it was endorsed. If somebody drank too much, according to someone else, that was enough to remove a child. In 1913, when my dad was 4.5 years old, coincidentally at the same time, my great-grandfather was raising 2 young kids aged 6 and 8 as a single parent, unemployed in Croydon, and he had a lot of company. There was an awful lot of unemployment. He was also in his 60s, looking for work. So the 8-year-old and the 6-year-old took my toddler father to school with them, as did 25,000 other kids. So one solution to school overcrowding with underage kids is take the kids away and put them into homes. My father was in a hospital briefly for 6 months or so, and it took a while to piece the puzzle together, but one factor was my grandmother was pregnant with her 2nd child, and my father had German measles. That's a threat to a pregnancy. So my grandmother took my father back to her ex-husband by then and hoped he could take care of him while she had the 2nd child. So now my great-grandfather has 3 kids at home that he's having trouble providing for. His own children went down the block to the church, to the soup kitchen along with older men, because they didn't have much food. That created a problem for the vicar. It was also a problem that, oh my God, this man had been treated wrongly by his wife and had an illegitimate child, and oh my God, The church is somehow paying to have my father in hospital, so the vicar initiated the apprehension of my father. No legal reason, no physical reason, the kids weren't neglected, but there was a moral reason. So off my dad went. He was put on a train at 3.5 years old, had a name tag put on his shirt, alone on a train for 3 hours off to a little village called Halesworth, Suffolk. Little village, 100 people. Excellent choice according to the Waifs and Strays Society. Get them out of London, fresh air. Right. He was placed in the care of a very elderly and very impoverished family in Halesworth. They were so poor that he was forced to wear women's boots at 4 years old that deformed his feet. It takes a couple of years to deform a child's feet, but anything was better than having my father with his family. He was in this foster home for 8 years until he was 12. He went to school in a very small village. He was known as the Waif. Didn't really have a name. And they were impoverished. They weren't cruel, they weren't abusive, but if anything, they were guilty of simply neglecting him. I don't know where he slept. I don't know how he treated. He never talked about it. Interesting thing about my father was, if there was anything positive to say, he would have said it. So his silence spoke loudly as to what it was like to live with these old, poor people in a small village. As far as inspection as to his welfare, he saw a social worker the day he was delivered there. Again, a 4-year-old kid on a train with a name tag alone because they didn't want to spend the price of a ticket for a social worker to accompany him. The last time he saw an inspector was 8 years later when they were fattening him up to put him in the orphanage. They didn't seem to notice his malformed feet. They didn't seem to notice his teeth falling out or the clothes he was wearing. They just put him on a train again, alone, for a 3-hour ride to London, where somebody picked him up and took him off to the orphanage, a new home to replace the one he had with his family. St. Augustine's Home for Boys was a brutal place. The first thing he lost was his name. He wasn't Fred Snow anymore. He was boy number 14. If he called himself Fred, he was caned. If he called another boy by his name, he was caned. If he talked on the way to school, it's a check mark and he got caned. The diet hadn't changed since the 1880s. And in the 1920s, when he was living in this orphanage, because obviously he was an orphan, he was put on bread and water for 3 days after losing a soccer game at 12 years old. If he didn't eat his moldy porridge for breakfast one day, he got it the next day and the next day until he ate it. Clothing wasn't all that adequate, although they gave him new shoes that kind of fit him. I think his teeth were still falling out by then. Very rigid rules in the home. You don't talk, you don't use your name, and you watch the daily caning every night. At the age of 15, he was given a choice. Boy, number 14. Where do you want to go? Canada or Australia? Not really given a choice of staying in England because, oh, He was an orphan. He doesn't have a family. There's no place to go. A friend of his chose Canada, so he chose Canada too. He could have gone to Australia. And that's the choice. And they called it emigration. I call it deportation. So they put him on a ship and shipped him off to Canada. To Sherbrooke, Quebec, to work on farms where everyone spoke French. I actually had someone post a thing on Facebook asking, well, they must have taught them French before they sent them over. Sure they did. 6, 8, 10-year-olds put on a French farm. Good luck. Sleep in the barn with the animals. You don't speak their language. You're in a foreign country. You don't have a name, and nobody knows who you are, and you could die, and nobody cared. So the better life in Canada for a boy was to work 14 hours a day, in short pants, in the winter, sleep in a barn, be allowed into the farmhouse once in a while, only if they wanted to make fun of you and your English accent. I don't know what they called him. Boy? Waif? Stray? Orphan? But my father survived that. When he was out of care, at the age of 18, he and a friend headed west to make their fortune. But it was also 1929. Oh, I'm sorry. When he was first out of care, he had nowhere to go. He'd broken his arm and spent a year in the hospital in Sherbrooke, Quebec. So he and his friend enlisted in the Reserve Army Service Corps, just so they could have a roof over their heads and a few meals a day. 1929, he and his friend headed west to make their fortune. But it was also the Great Depression. So he wound up riding boxcars for a good 2 to 3 years, back and forth across Canada. And yes, I know, hundreds of thousands of other men rode the boxcars too. But people knew who they were. They had families they could turn to. My father and all the other British home children riding the trains, nobody knew who they were, nobody cared. They could die in a ditch and never be found, buried as John Does. Because, oh, gee, they didn't have any identity. Nothing to prove who they were. My father was 20 years old when he first wrote to the Waifs and Strays. He used his left hand. He had a beautiful script because his right arm got broken and it took a year to fix, and they put a plate in it. But he wrote to them, "Dear Sir, would you be so kind as, do you have any information about my parents? Do I have any brothers and sisters?" He was pleading. I am living in darkness, and I don't know who I am. He died at the age of 85. Living in darkness and not knowing who he was. He tried for 60 years. It's not like he didn't try. They knew who he was. They didn't tell him. For one simple reason. He would have found his family, and they couldn't have that. He's supposed to disappear and become invisible in Canada. And that's what happened to the British home children. They didn't disappear, they were disappeared. Canada's invisible immigrants, they were called. As a descendant of a British home child, I feel as invisible as my parents did. We all know what a visible minority is. I empathize and I sympathize with them. What they have going for them is they are visible. The British home children descendants are not visible. We are invisible. We don't exist. We've been ignored because we don't raise our voices very well. We're all very nice people and we don't complain. But now there's 10 million of us. What is that all about? This story does not appear in any public books. It's not part of our curriculum. I went to school for almost 20 years. My children have gone to schools for another 15 years. You will not find this story being told in the schools. Why is it so studiously avoided? What is everybody hiding? Well, the Canadian government doesn't want anybody to know. They bought and sold and illegally transported these children to Canada, and they dropped the ball in looking out for their welfare. They assume the child care organizations would inspect these kids, ensure their welfare, but that never happened. So someone is responsible for a large segment of the Canadian population being invisible. And I don't think it's the descendants who chose not to be seen. So after being homeless for a couple of years riding the boxcars, my father wound up in a work camp in Northern Ontario. Another solution to the massive unemployment of the Great Depression: put all single men into work camps to construct the Trans-Canada Highway or make work projects. So he became a timekeeper there in his early 20s. And he also started taking a correspondence course to upgrade his education. All he had was the equivalent of maybe grade 8 before he came to Canada. Many younger boys had very little education and had to make their way through lives without upgrading it. While at the work camp, Victoria Day weekend came along and he was invited into Port Arthur by my Perry uncle. And that is how he met my mother. They fell in love and she saved his life. They married in the Great Depression, and their first home, that I call the honeymoon tent, was a tent. Dad had a semblance of a secure job laboring in a gravel pit. That was enough indication to say, hey, let's get married and create a life and a family. And they did. The gravel pit job was short-lived, so they packed up the cooking stove, hopped a train, and went off to do some gold mining. St. Anthony Gold Mine in Northern Ontario. Again, a fairly apparently secure job, was good for about a year. And my brother was born there. Working conditions undermined gold mining were pretty primitive in the 30s, and it lasted about a year. And because of the conditions and threats to his health, decided to quit. Hopped another boxcar and back to Thunder Bay, constantly looking for work. Much of my father's life was forever looking for work. He got his first permanent job when he was 60. Uninterrupted work for 5 years carried him through to 65, where he was entitled to a pension. Even then, if you couldn't prove who you were, you might not even get a Canadian pension. Somehow he became a Canadian citizen in 1972. Prior to that, the only piece of identification he had was a tattered letter from the Waifs and Strays identifying him as a waif and stray who came to Canada and was, quote, of British origins, British nationality. Not English, not Welsh, not Scotch, not Irish, of British nationality. Middle-aged man with 5 kids. Do you have any identification? Well, yes. Waifs and strays of British nationality. Oh, that should work. That's good enough to get married. That's good enough to enlist in World War II. And he continued to write to the waifs and strays and continued not to receive any information as to who he was. He pressed for a great many searches to try and find a birth certificate. He had no success because obviously there was no birth certificate. The waifs and strays finally, after 45 years, gave him a baptism certificate. They had it in their possession for 45 years. And all it said is his mother was an Annie Gifford and his father was Snow. No first name. So he lived his life without an identity. He lived his life writing letters to the waifs and strays. I don't know who I am. My family's entitled to know. Who am I? And he got nothing. But he somehow managed to raise 6 kids. 5 of them turned out okay. One of them has an attitude problem, but that's known to happen. At his funeral service, as painful as that was, I looked up and down the aisles. There was my mother and 5 of us. No grandparents to notify of his death, no parents, no uncles, no aunts, no cousins, no nothing. So it hit me even harder. I'm not related to any Snow in North America or England. How could that possibly be? So I told my mother, I'm going to find his family. And it took an awful lot of effort, an awful lot of time, and an awful lot of persistence. My parents made it a little easier because after my dad died, my mom gave me a file of all their correspondence with England. They kept every scrap of paper they wrote to and received from Church of England Waifs and Strays Society for Finding Homes for Children. I flipped through it and it was pretty obvious. Somebody is lying. Why would my father and mother persist in writing after getting no answers? We have no records. We have no information. The only reason they persisted is they didn't believe them. So I took it on myself because I didn't believe them either. And eventually I held a piece of paper that proved they lied. For 50 and 60 years, they withheld information. They tried withholding it from me, and on and on and on. All descendants are up against the same thing. The organizations hide behind their protestation that they are not obliged to release information about their wards. They argue that they're protecting the privacy of their old boys and girls. Well, I'm sorry, you didn't own them. They all came from families. You cut the ties with the family. You made sure the families couldn't visit. You told the kids their parents were dead. You told the parents you don't know where the kids are. You send a brother and sister to Canada. You send the brother to Quebec. You send the sister to Manitoba. They never see each other. You send a brother and sister to different countries. One to Canada, a sister to Australia. They'll never see each other again. Because the agencies held all the cards and held all the information, and they're still holding it. Because they do not want people to know the truth. of how children were treated, how their names were changed, how birth certificates were altered, and on and on and on it goes, and it's got to stop. No descendant is in a position to challenge these organizations that have been around for 100 years. There were 50 of them. There could be 6 or 8 prominent ones still existing. But if you were to write to them, I just found out my uncle was a home child, you are going to get a form letter. Well, we're kind of committed to releasing information to the children, who are now 80, only to them. You're not an immediate descendant. So the door slams and the door slams again. And time goes by and they outweight everyone and generations die and they hope we're all going to go away. But we haven't gone away yet. Access to this information has to change. And our government, our Canadian government, had a role to play in this horrible scheme. They bought children, they sold children, they relinquished the responsibility of the care of the children to the organizations who sent them over for their own purposes. The organizations were in no position to inspect these kids all over Canada, based in southern Ontario and Quebec. How does an inspector make her way up to Thunder Bay to investigate kids working at a dairy farm in northern Ontario? How often are they going to check? Never. One of the saddest things about this scheme was the propaganda that these kids would have better lives in Canada and happy homes, that they would be adopted into Canadian families. No one has found any evidence of an actual formal adoption of a child by farmers. Informally adopted into a family, yes. But guess what? The child lost the only name they had. Better life in Canada is a very specious argument. How could a child answer? Compared to what? Compared to staying in England? All I knew in England was an orphanage where they beat me and didn't let me talk. In my case, I discovered I had 3 aunts and uncles. They stayed in England. They were also in orphanages. In the mid-1920s, people were so enthusiastic about the scheme that they wanted to immigrate 4 million children into Canada. How do you do that? They have to be orphans. Are you going to kill 8 million parents? The Great Depression put a halt to that, but otherwise, what were people thinking? Children aged 6 to 14, a 6-year-old boy, a 6-year-old girl, put on a boat, shipped to Canada, unescorted, uninspected. The most tragic thing about this scheme was some were treated well. That gets distorted way out of proportion to its actual incidence. People have guessed 2 out of 3 have been mistreated. I think over 90% of these children were abused in Canada. But nobody likes to say, oh, you mean psychologically? No, they were beaten, they were raped, they were drowned, they were stabbed, and they were buried in unmarked mass graves. That is not a better life in Canada, I'm sorry. And who mistreated them? Canadians. That is a very, very difficult thing for anyone to accept or admit. But they were sent to Canada. They were sold to farmers. And they were treated this way by Canadians. Oh, Canada. It's a sad commentary on human nature, but if you know a child is part of a family and part of a tribe, they are protected. You don't mess with someone else's child. Wars are conducted because someone mistreated someone's child. But if a child doesn't belong to anybody, it's up for grabs. The same rules don't apply. And this is what happened to the British home children who didn't belong to anybody. They were more vulnerable than any other child in Canada. Mass graves, unmarked graves. So I'm not always terribly proud to be a Canadian. Thousands of these boys enlisted in World War I. A great many of them underage. I transcribed personally the records of 5,000 boys who entered into World War I. Thousands of them were killed. No record. Every group that served in one has been recognized as a group. Women in World War I, blacks in World War I, Newfoundlanders in World War I. You will find no reference to British home children in World War I. They are a distinct group. They belonged to no one. They were orphanized. When they enlisted, next of kin, no one. Next of kin, Bernardo's, assigned life insurance to the organization. But they died in World War I, like a great many other thousands of men. The difference was nobody noticed. There was no family to notify of their death. And yet still today, they are not recognized, even for serving in World War I. World War II, nobody knows. Because again, they're invisible. They disappeared. And somehow Canada has allowed that. I have a little problem around Canada Day too, for the same reason. Every conceivable immigrant group in Canada has been recognized. And so they should. But there's one group that is missing. And it is a very large group. 150,000 children, 10 million descendants. So I get a little embarrassed around Canada Day. Because I watch the parades and I watch the ceremonies and I watch the celebration. I'm going, something's missing here. What's missing is one of the largest immigrant groups to Canada. And did I mention they were children? In the next segment, I'll be talking about the search I inherited from my father for his stolen identity. And that includes a couple of years of dealing with the Waifs and Strays Society and a couple of years of dealing with Bernardo's. After I found out that my father had 2 brothers and 2 aunts. And that was a surprise discovery as well.